Okay, good morning everyone. So my name is Miriam Kerner. I'm also from the Council, and as Sharon, this is one of my last sort of official appearances. It's a pleasure to share this first session of today's seminar. We're talking about text recycling. So before I'm going to introduce all the three, they come in a trio, the speakers. I'm going to check, while I get started, I'm going to check you all awake. So we're doing some interactive. So hands up if you think that self-plagiarism is more common in your work than plagiarism. Good. Excellent. So, and then, second question, you're still awake. Have you ever had approached an author about self-plagiarism and they have come back completely bewildered about what you're talking about when you... Oh, there's... Hands are shooting up. Okay, you're in the right session because I've got the experts here for you. They have worked on the first large-scale investigation on this topic. We have here three of the lead investigators, so Cary Moskovitz. He's the lead PI. He's an associate professor of the practice and director of writing the disciplines at Duke University. We have Michael Pemberton. He's the professor of writing and linguistics and director of the University Writing Center at Georgia Southern University. And he's also a fellow editor across the disciplines. And we have David Hansen. He's the associate university librarian for research, collections and scholarly communications, lead copyright and information policy officer at Duke University Libraries. So I'm going to hand over for them. They're going to give this presentation in the next 45 minutes or so, and I'm going to take all the questions at the end. So do make notes of all your questions, and we'll have like at least 15-20 minutes at the end to have a good discussion. So with further ado, here we go. Thanks.
There are a number of people working on this project. In addition to those of us who are here today, I want to recognize Chris Hansen, Ian Hansen, Suzanne Hall, and Agnes Gamble, all of whom we will be sharing some of their work today. The main part of our discussion today will cover these three areas, which are the three fundamental things that we're studying in the first phase of research. Basically, beliefs and attitudes. What do gatekeepers across academic fields believe about appropriate text recycling practice? What do STEM researchers actually do with recycling in practice, issues related to legality, copyright, and contracts, and then we'll talk briefly about implications in our future work. To start, I would like you all to think about two scenarios, and I'm going to ask you to quickly read through these and think to yourself if you would answer the question, is it appropriate, in a simple yes or no, and just remember your answer and stick with it. So we're not going to bother with the electronic survey version of this. We'll trust you all. Okay, scenario one, Dr. Wilson is a biology professor. He published a paper that included a detailed technical description of an experimental apparatus. Dr. Wilson is now writing another paper reporting on a new study. Because the study uses the same apparatus, he uses the exact description of that apparatus from his prior paper. Don't answer now. You don't need to nod your heads. Just think to yourself. Would you say, yes, that's appropriate, or no, that's not appropriate, without getting into the nuances at this point? Okay. You can make a note for yourself, mental or physical. And here's one more scenario. Sarah is a biology doctoral student doing research under Professor Wilson. Dr. Wilson has asked Sarah to write the first draft of another related paper for which he will be co-author. Since the same apparatus was used for this investigation, Dr. Wilson suggests Sarah copy and paste the diagram of the apparatus from the prior paper. Do you believe that this is appropriate? Yes or no? Think about it for a moment. Okay, time's up. All right. Scenario A. Raise your hand if you said yes, you feel that's appropriate. Raise your hand if you thought not appropriate. Okay.
We got caveats?
No. We will discuss caveats at the end of our talk. There's lots to talk about. But it's great that you want to. All right, scenario B. Given all you know right here, raise your hand if you believe this is appropriate. And not? Beautiful.
Caveats.
Okay. So, this is an example of the kind of thing that we're talking about. You can see the top passage and the bottom passage, and it's color-coded just to be able to let you quickly align what's the same, which is basically everything except the citation reference in the first one and the sample size. And the first paper, the prior one, was from Science, the second one from PNAS, which are certainly publications beyond general dispute about their value, and we would hope their ethics. It's important to talk about definitions, and so turns out to be a really difficult thing to define in a general way. So to start with, here is Cope's definition that was part of there in the Biomed Central guidelines for editors. I'll let you look at that for a moment. And briefly, just want to talk through some of the things that could be confusing or ambiguous. So if we're talking about sections, I imagine most people in this room will think, well, we don't mean literally sections necessarily like the methods or the results sections, but what exactly constitutes a chunk of text recycling? Is it the same? That is, does it have to be identical text recycling? Or if it's slightly altered, would that still be considered recycled text? Does it have to be text in terms of prose, or would it cover equations or visual materials? Is it attributed or not? Basically, that might mean it should be cited, but it could also be cited and still not be clear that it was recycled at all, because when you see a citation, you can't tell if it's the ideas or the actual material that's being reused there. You'll note that this is framed in terms of authors singular, although certainly in the STEM world, that's the rare, right, rather than the norm. And in terms of publications, are we talking about only material which is published, or source material and or destination material which might have been unpublished or circulated in different ways, right? So I think, and we think, it's actually wonderful how much Cope has done to help put something reasonable in front of people. The document itself talks about it as being a starting point, not a finish point, and you can see some of the issues that we think need to be investigated and clarified, hopefully. I spent many, many hours in work in a prior paper trying to come up with what would be an internally consistent and sound definition, and I will say I was never satisfied, but at some point you have to stop. So this is our current working definition. Text recycling is the reuse of textual material, prose, visuals, or equations from one document in a new document where the material in the new document is identical to that of the source or substantially equivalent in form and in content. The material serves the same rhetorical function of both documents, meaning, for instance, it's not being artistically repurposed. And at least one of the authors of the new document is also an author of a prior document. That itself is also a fairly complicated thing. Maybe we'll have some time to talk about. Another thing that's important as a starting point is to establish that text recycling as a practice is broadly considered to be ethically neutral. Here from one part of Cope's own guidelines, you can see the use of similar identical phrases in particular method sections is not unusual, and in fact it may be unavoidable, and may actually be of value when a technique that's common to a number of papers describe. So we're not suggesting that all text recycling is inherently appropriate. We just want to start from a point of view of saying we believe, like Cope, that text recycling is not always inherently inappropriate. I'm going to skip this for time's sake here. Terminology briefly, Cope uses text recycling. Self-plagiarism was the default term for a long time. We use text recycling probably for the same reason Cope does. That is, if you assume that the practice is not fundamentally and always inappropriate, then using self-plagiarism causes a lot of cognitive dissonance as one talks about the situations in which self-plagiarism might be appropriate given the loaded nature of that language. So Michael's going to share the first of our research findings with you next. I'll come back and talk a little bit about our kind of corpus text analysis, and then David will follow up with our legal analysis.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you again, as Cary said, for inviting us to be here. I'm mostly involved with one phase of the project that has to do with the perceptions and beliefs that editorial gatekeepers have about text recycling. We thought as a way to certainly get started in this discussion and some of our research, it would be good to be grounded in notions of what is it that editors actually believe about text recycling, and also, do they put those beliefs into practice? Do they have different standards for what they do as editors as opposed to what they believe as writers or as authors? And also, what are some of the nuances that editors and editorial gatekeepers impose when they're thinking about the issue of text recycling and whether or not it would be appropriate to address these issues with an author or not? So my part of the project was working on beliefs and practices, and I'm going to be reporting on two separate studies that we've conducted. The first of which was a large-scale survey of of editors-in-chief and editorial board members of a number of journals in a variety of different disciplines. And then the second study that I'm going to be talking briefly about is a somewhat more detailed set of interviews that we held with editors, investigating some of these nuances that we're talking about. What conditions do they believe apply? What criteria do they hold? And what do they do when they're making decisions for their own journals? So this is the first study that we conducted, which was the survey of gatekeepers across academia. I'll give you some quick numbers here. We targeted 20 journal editors and editorial board members from each of the top 85 journals in 16 academic fields. And in addition to these fields, we also surveyed a number of people from our own discipline, which is rhetoric and composition or writing studies, because we thought that they might be able to provide some interesting perspectives dealing as they do with many issues of rhetoric and writing and composition that might be applicable. So we selected, to determine our survey sample, we selected 5 top English language journals from each of the 15 initial fields, and we used 2 methods to determine which of those journals we would survey. For the journals in STEM and the social science fields, we selected the top journals as ranked by the 2015 Eigenfactor scores from the Web of Science's Journal Citation Reports. And for journals in the humanities and the arts, we selected top journals using Sci-Imago's Journal Rank Indicator scores for 2015. We sent our initial survey to 1,580 editors and editorial board members, and we received 316 responses, which was approximately a 20% response rate. These are the respondents' disciplinary clusters that they fell into. We had about 40.9% from the quantitative and qualitative social sciences, 31.2% from the humanities, and collapsed together 21.7% from the natural sciences, engineering, and health sciences, with about 6.3% of other that fell into categories that did not fit into those other fields. The questions that we asked in this survey were many in nature, and one of the primary questions that we asked, obviously, was whether or not, in general, these editors and editorial board members felt that text recycling was always unacceptable. In fact, as you'll see here, most of the respondents across all disciplinary clusters believed that, in fact, text recycling was acceptable in some circumstances, that it wasn't unilaterally and uniformly something that was considered to be unethical. There was a slightly higher percentage in the humanities and the quantitative social sciences that thought that it was perhaps less acceptable, but overall, between 80 and 90% thought that it was acceptable in some contexts at least. We investigated the source of the recycled text. In other words, is it more or less appropriate for people to recycle this text, depending upon where it initially appeared, where it's being recycled from. We had a range of different possible sort of groups that they could respond to, including such things as conference posters, grant proposals, conference papers, internal and external grant reports, conference proceedings, and also recycling text from a previously published journal article. Our general findings about this are that the degree to which a text is considered to be published or accessible, and those are not equivalent terms, but they have some overlapping context there, That's what generally seems to influence editors' perceptions of whether or not it's acceptable to recycle a particular piece of text. Those presentations or those texts that are considered to be works in progress, or that are given to or presented to or are accessible to relatively small audiences, the acceptability of text recycling seems to be significantly higher than those for which accessibility and audience and official publication is considered to be important. So even though, for example, you'll see down at the top, for example, conference posters which are presented to a relatively small audience in a relatively small venue and are often considered to be presentations of works in process rather than final projects, well, most editors seem to think that it was acceptable to recycle at least some text from those sources. But if you get to the point where you take a look at journal articles, for example, even in those cases where you would think that it would be more clearly a published text and it might be less acceptable, there are still a significant number of editors that responded that said in some contexts and for some purposes, recycling may still be appropriate. You're killing me. All right. Structure location also was something that we looked at and that seemed to be influential in determining whether or not it was acceptable. As you can see here, method sections, unsurprisingly, were more generally considered to be acceptable as recycling, to recycle from. But even in some of the others, including such things as results and discussion, editors were willing to be somewhat open about the possibility that there may in fact be points at which some text recycling might be appropriate to include. We also considered the issue of authorship, such as whether or not text recycling was acceptable under the following conditions. The first one was where you have multiple authors and the source and the new text are identical. The second, where the source and the text share at least one author and the others give permission. The next case where they share an author but the others have not given explicit permission. The third one, or the fourth one, which is actually one of the more intriguing results that we got, which was all authors of the new text work within a lab or a long-term research group. So they're all contributing to the same general set of studies that produce this work and have some authors, one or more authors in common. And then the last category was as above, where they're working in a research group, but none of the authors were common to the earlier text. And the interesting result that we have here, at least the one that's most interesting to me, is that when we said, if you're looking at recycled text from a large research working group, there might be one or more overlapping authors, but not all. About a third said it seemed that it would be appropriate, about a third said it was not appropriate, and about a third said, we don't know. The second part, or the second study that we did had to do with these editor interviews that we conducted. We asked one of the questions on our initial survey about whether or not the people who responded would be interested or willing to be interviewed in a follow-up study, and we drew most of our respondents from that group of people, but we ended up going outside of that group when we had a relatively few number of people in some disciplines in order to make it relatively even. So we ended up with 21 editors and editors-in-chief, 7 from STEM, 7 from the humanities, and 7 in the social sciences. And then on the right-hand side, this is a basic breakdown of the number of years of experience they had had as editors. And this does not include editorial board members. These are people who are specifically identified as editors or editors-in-chief. This is the interview protocol. We began with a definition of text recycling. We asked them, first of all, about their personal experiences with text recycling, whether or not they had done it themselves. Secondly, their editorial experiences with recycling, how much and to what extent had they encountered this as editors from authors. We had a third section that explored some of the variables that might apply in terms of text recycling. And then we asked them some final questions about their beliefs and collected demographic information. This is sort of a very quick overview of the coding scheme that we used. We began by taking these interviews. We generated summaries from all of the people on this part of the research team generated summaries in order to identify broad general categories of response. And then we went into the transcripts of the interviews and coded them in terms of the principles, the categories, all of the variables that we felt were useful to describe. This is just a short section of some of the coding categories that were used by editors, for example, to justify or to condemn text recycling. We ended up having 1,866 individual codes across 198 different categories and subcategories. And this is just a very brief word cloud to give you kind of a sense of the types of issues that were identified in these interviews and in these transcripts as being more or less important in determination of the acceptability or unacceptability of some text recycling. This is not an indication of the editors or the number of editors individually who responded in these ways, because this is more of a reflection of the number of times people referred to these issues. And in some cases, editors would come back to these topics again and again and again. So, very briefly, initial findings, first of all, having to do with the concept of originality. Virtually all of the editors who responded said originality is very important, in fact, it's critically important as an issue, but the ways in which editors defined original contribution and original text was widely divergent. In some cases, originality meant an originality of contributing new knowledge to the field. And in other cases, some editors said, no, when we're talking about originality in a text, we're talking about the fact that absolutely every sentence has to be different from any sentence that has ever been written or published before about this subject by that author. Okay. Yeah, believe it or not, it's true. There were some hardliners out there. Second was rewriting text. We asked them, under what circumstances would you ask authors to rewrite text? There were mixed reasons and mixed perceptions of value. Some of them took a very positive spin and said rewriting text is a generative function, and it forces authors to rethink the ideas and maybe come up with sort of new ways of expressing things that will make new contributions. Others of them said that the reason why they ask authors to rewrite text is because they don't want to be accused of copyright violations, they don't want to be perceived of copyright violations, they don't want to do anything that would threaten the reputability of the journal, so they take a very, very, I won't say fearful, but extremely apprehensive view about whether or not they should ask authors to rewrite text. Circulation and accessibility was another issue that was also important, as I indicated before in a previous slide, but there were very different perceptions about what was considered to be published work. Some cases were relatively obvious, book chapters, journal articles, those sorts of things, but when you come down to preprints, blog posts, and a number of other types of things that might be considered published, there were widely divergent opinions about that. The issue of copyright, almost every editor was very concerned about this, but not every editor was completely knowledgeable about what copyright law was. And David is going to be talking about that issue more extensively. And then lastly, one of the things we wanted to know implicitly was whether or not editors' beliefs about text recycling was something that translated directly into their practices as editors. Mostly it did, for some it did not. There were some who made very clear that they thought that many of the strictures against text recycling were pointless and ridiculous, but as editors they enforced them anyway, for the reasons of making sure that their journal had a very high reputation and that they did not run into problems with copyright. I'd be happy to talk about some of the interesting anecdotes that we collected as a result of this. But a number of them said that what they did as writers themselves was very different from what they told their graduate students to do when they're thinking about writing and publishing texts. So that's a very brief overview of the beliefs and attitudes section of our study, and I will turn it over to
Me.
Cary.
Involves doing an analysis of published papers to try to learn what authors actually do in terms of recycling versus what people say they believe or say they do. I'm going to take you through this very quickly. Our results that we've been working on for about a year, basically within the last 3 weeks, we've gotten our results, so we've gotten some preliminary analysis here. What we want to know is basically how common is text recycling, what patterns do we tend to see, and are there variations across discipline that we could track. The corpus was built briefly this way, using the NSF, National Science Foundation, the state search tool. We identified 4 of the major directorates. From each of those, we identified 20 grants that ended in 2015. And for each of those grants, we chose grants that have at least 5 published papers, and then we picked the first 5 published papers. And so the corpus consists basically of 80 grants, each of which has 5 papers, and then we did a computational pairwise comparison among each of the papers in that set to look for recycled text within that project, basically. We have a paper that's forthcoming describing our methods. I'm not going to talk about it here, but hopefully it will be published in the next month or so. We wanted to make sure that the stuff that the code was identifying as text recycling was the kind of stuff that we thought of as text recycling. So briefly, here are, out of just a quick random sample we did of 20 hits, 3 pretty typical examples. You can see the source paper on the left, following paper on the right, and these are just passages of identical content. And clearly, the kind of stuff you're seeing is not like commonplaces. These aren't phrases that everybody would use. It's very idiosyncratic language that would be specific to those authors or author groups. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Then we saw, that was, I say, the majority of this quick look at these 20. Then we saw some things that looked more like this. You can see the top example, identical text, except the replacement of instructed with asked and if for whether. Or in the second example, where you have the identical sentence, except the swapping of some clauses. I'm sure you all are used to seeing this kind of stuff. And then in the one at the bottom, something a little more complex, but still clearly some exact recycled text, and then some other stuff that was added to it. And then there were few, but maybe 2 or 3 out of those that looked more like this. And these were ones that were basically just making it across the threshold of what our code said, scoring above this number we're going to call text recycling. These were just above that margin, and you can see here that these are pretty ambiguous cases and how we might judge those. So we felt good that the code seemed to be giving us the kind of stuff we want, and the scoring was proportional to what we would consider to be definitely recycled text or maybe not. So just a couple of quick results here. This is just from the 20 biology area grants. Each of these bars represents a single grant of 5 papers with pairwise comparison. And these are the number of sentences that the code identified as having at least some recycled text. And these are ordered just in decreasing score. So you can see roughly a fourth of these had approximately 5% or more recycled text. Right? And then when we get to the right-hand side, the code did not identify any of those having them. And now that you know, left-hand side is in sentences, and on the axis, and then on the horizontal axis, those are just individual grants. Here are the 4 different clusters: biology, engineering, math and physical sciences, and social behavioral economic sciences. The magnitudes are different, but the patterns we found were remarkably similar. Somewhere around a quarter of each of the grants, so each of these represent 20 grants, recycled somewhere in the area of 5% or more recycled material and then tail off, right? So we're not seeing, at least at first glance, any substantial disciplinary variation, which really surprised me, particularly with the social sciences. I do need to make clear that the social sciences that get NSF grants tend to be the more quantitative of those, right? These don't represent kind of essayistic or ethnographic work.
My part of this project was is to work through some of the legal issues associated with text recycling. As Michael mentioned, this is an area where there is some significant, if not misunderstandings, I think confusion and questions among editors and among authors. We've seen that in some of the survey work that they've done, and as well in a kind of separate piece that we have done with authors that is not quite ready to talk through yet. I want to start off by making clear that the legal issues associated with text recycling, self-plagiarism, are inherently jurisdictional. Law just works that way. Every jurisdiction has slightly different rules. Even with copyright law, there is really no international copyright law that has firm rules that would apply to this type of situation. We have kind of broad treaties that address basic issues like basic protections for authors, but it is inherently jurisdictional. And that's a really important thing to know as I talk through this, because we have approached this very much from a U.S. perspective, although some of these things do have some international corollaries. The other big thing is that there is, in general across jurisdictions, no particular laws that deal with this situation specifically. In fact, in most jurisdictions, there aren't even specific laws dealing with plagiarism, not just plagiarism. So for instance, in the United States, we really don't have any laws that are addressing plagiarism in this context. A handful of states will have laws that deal with the student context of plagiarism, but not in this context. So mostly we're left with a whole set of other laws that are kind of layered over this that weren't designed specifically to address this issue. And that's as true for copyright as it is for many other things. If you understand kind of how copyright law has developed in the United States and most other jurisdictions, scholarly publications were not like the top issue that legislatures were considering when they created those laws. It was mostly, major content industry, film, music, those sort of things. If you go through in the U.S. the legislative history, you'll see these handful of little blips where scholarly publishers will show up, or academics, or universities, but it was mostly designed to deal with lots of other issues. So the big issues, though, in the room that we've seen come up and that are kind of baseline that we need to address here are two. One is copyright law, and the other is contracts. So I'm going to go through these. The next button. Okay. So a really fundamental, important place to start is if you're talking about copyright issues with reusing your own work, it's important to understand, well, who owns your work as an author? And this is something where there is some international uniformity. So I'm just going to put up this slide here. This shows different variations on basic grants of rights to authors as the initial creators of their work. This is true almost universally across the world, that authors are the initial holders of rights in their work. Now, there are a handful of variations in specific circumstances where you may have, for instance, an institution claiming that their faculty's work belongs to the institution as a work for hire. But at least in the United States and in most of Europe, that's not the case. There's a more of a sense that those things belong to authors at the initial. So why this is important to set up is if you're trying to make out, is there a copyright situation with an author reusing his or her own work, it's important to understand why, well, if they're the initial copyright holder, what's the big deal? And the big deal, I think, is pretty straightforward. Excuse me. This is a pretty typical contract. This is pulled from Elsevier. I could have pulled a similar clause from any major scholarly publisher, or most scholarly publishers, that have a clause in most publishing contracts that assigns or grants an exclusive license over rights in the author's initial contribution. This is where that transfer of authorship or transfer of ownership from author to publisher happens. This isn't true across the board. There are exceptions. A really big one now is open access publications, where open access publishers will say, actually, you get to retain rights. We just need a permission to publish this thing. That's all we need. And so the author kind of is the repository for all residual rights in that work and can make choices about how to reuse it or not from a copyright perspective. But this is pretty typical. So you have this flow of rights that goes from the author to publisher. And this is where you set up the basic conflict, right? Where these rights have flowed to the publisher, say, of the initial publication. And then the issue is, well, what if that author wants to reuse some of that work with a journal published by a different publisher? It's pretty basic, but I wanted to clear that error at the outset, because that tracking of ownership of rights is very, very important, both from a copyright perspective and a contract perspective. So there is.
4 minutes.
So from the U.S. perspective, there are some really interesting things, and I think this is actually a nice thing to point out to you all, the very international audience, because this highlights how the law in every jurisdiction is very different. So in the United States, we have something that is not unique, but is pretty special about U.S. law called fair use. It's this kind of principle-based approach to whether you're allowed to use a work without permission. And basically what happens here is we have these set of factors that courts look at, and there's no hard and fast rule. There's no set of, like, you can use 10% or you can use 1,000 words or a particular number of chapters from a book or anything like that. It's this kind of mushy analysis that happens in front of the courts. One of the particularly challenging things about this in the U.S. too is there are almost no cases dealing specifically with this type of issue. They're almost all, dealing with, Google copied lots of stuff from somebody else, and is it okay or not, right? And then we have to take that and figure out how to make an analogy to, gee, I'm writing an academic article about this issue and I want to reuse my methods section, for example. So that's very different from other jurisdictions. So this is the basic flow that we are trying to work through, and copyright is that initial thing that we're looking at. Copyright sort of acts in the background as the default set of rules that apply here. But a really important issue from this directionality, right? Your previously published article, let's say with publisher A, you're recycling that into this new article. A major issue in between all of this are the contracts, right? And so you have a contract with publisher A that says one thing about what you're allowed to do, and then we actually need to look at contract with publisher B that talks about what you're allowed to use from previously published work. So you have a kind of dueling contract issue here. One of the big issues, and we've done some analysis, a pretty big analysis of different publishing contracts that we were able to get our hands on. And this is something I also know anecdotally just from working with lots of authors with publishing contracts, is they vary significantly in the kind of information that they provide, where they specify, if at all, anything about reuse of text, and what specifically is allowed. So I have a few examples just to highlight some of the variation. So this is some text from a copyright permissions section in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it talks about authors may not use or authorize use of contribution without written consent. So it's very clear, but it's actually pretty restrictive. So the virtue in this is authors know what they're allowed and not allowed to do. It's just it doesn't allow them to do very much. And so there's some benefit to that, but it's a challenge as well. There are some other examples here that I think are really interesting. And I'll just mention here another fascinating thing about this is when you think about copyright law and contracts, one of the big conflicts is which do those default rules apply or do the contract rules apply. In this case, what you have is a flat-out restriction, but then you have this carve-out to say, oh, but actually this part of U.S. fair use law, you can still apply that. So if fair use law would allow you to do some text recycling, then that's still allowed. Where this gets really fascinating is, as far as I can tell, the New England Journal of Medicine does not have a different contract for people who are outside the U.S. And so you may have, for example, a Dutch author who now has to say, well, do I apply U.S. fair use law to what I am allowed to do with my own work in the future? It's a kind of interesting scenario of export of different concepts in U.S. law. So here's another one that's much more specific and actually grants some specific rights. So this is from American Chemical Society. It's very specific. In fact, I think this is among the most specific, well-defined. It really is a nice model. And it talks about how authors may reuse these different types of work. It gives some very specific boundaries, up to 400 words. That's a debatable thing. I don't know if that's the right number, but at least it talks specifically about it, and identifies specifically in subsequent scholarly publications. And then this goes the other direction. So that was, you sign the contract as an author of the first article. Now this talks about what you can do if you're reusing work from something else. And it gives some guidelines on permission. Interesting piece here about the copyright holder's permission being obtained. So ACS actually does this on both ends, both the sending journal and the receiving journal, and it's important that those contracts deal with both sides of that. So there's a whole lot more that could be said about copyright and contractual issues. The basic issues I want to underline here are that in these contracts, those are really critical pieces, especially given the variation in international copyright law and other laws. But there is not much similarity and not much consistency in the contracts that we have found. I pointed out a few that address these. The vast majority of contracts just don't address it at all, and that's a pretty glaring issue that I think deserves some attention going forward. Cary?
I want to make sure that we do have a good amount of time for a conversation, so I'm basically going to tell you the next phase of our work will include developing model guidelines, contracts, policies. We will be looking for stakeholders, for publishing, academia, professional societies to help us with crafting and revising those. Working towards, hopefully, the most clear and consistent set of guidelines that we could advance, because obviously having inconsistent and irregular guidelines makes things hard for everybody, and right now things are very idiosyncratic. So I'm going to stop here, skip these slides, and just tell you you can find our work at textrecycling.org. You're welcome to contact me if you're interested in any of that follow-up or phase 2 stuff. I'm sure my email is in the brochure there, as well as reaching out to my colleagues.